All right, so today we're diving into one of India's most complex and, let's be honest, emotionally charged topics, the reservation system. The source material for this explainer puts forward a really provocative argument that a system originally designed to fix social inequality may have, over time, ended up freezing the very identities it was meant to help people move beyond. So let's get into it. Wow, this one sentence really gets right to the heart of the whole thing, doesn't it? It's a huge paradox, and it perfectly sets up the question we're going to be exploring today. How on earth could a tool for justice accidentally become a structure that makes those divisions permanent? That's the puzzle we're going to try and piece together.
Okay, so to really get our heads around this argument, we have to start at the beginning. The source frames the reservation system not as some kind of handout, but as something very different: a ladder for justice.
And let's be super clear on this point. The source material pulls no punches here. The caste system wasn't just some abstract idea. It was a real, oppressive, and deeply unjust reality. For centuries, it systematically slammed the door on people's opportunities, their ability to move up in the world, and their basic human dignity. The reservation system was created as a direct answer to that historical wrong.
So, what was the original idea behind it? Well, our source defines reservation as a remedial intervention. Now, the two keywords there are remedial and until. Think of it like a course of medicine for a deep social wound. It was always meant to be temporary, with the ultimate goal of making itself unnecessary once the playing field was finally level. And this slide here kind of breaks down how that medicine was supposed to work. Step 1, compensate for all that historical exclusion. Step 2, create actual, real access to things like education and jobs. And step 3, and this is absolutely crucial, was to enable social mobility over time. The entire logic was built on the idea of movement, of climbing up and moving on. But this is where the central argument of our source really snaps into focus. It claims that over the decades, the whole function of the system started to shift, and pretty dramatically. It went from being that temporary ladder to something the author calls a permanent parking lot. You know, I think this metaphor is just so powerful because it makes the argument click instantly. A ladder, it's all about upward movement, right? It's a tool for one person to get from a lower level to a higher one and then, leave the ladder behind. But a parking lot, that's a designated permanent space for a whole group. The argument is that the system started acting less like a tool for individuals to climb and more like a reserved space for entire groups to just occupy forever. So you're probably asking, how did this even happen? Well, the source points to these three big shifts. First, the focus moved away from looking at an individual's actual disadvantage and just became about confirming what group they belonged to. Then eligibility stopped being something you could transition out of. It just became a static, inherited thing. And, most critically, the main goal sort of shifted from achieving social mobility for people to mobilizing politically to protect the group's spot. Now, according to the source, a shift this big doesn't happen without a cost. It actually led to a whole series of unintended and pretty deep paradoxes. Okay, check out this first paradox. It's a real head-scratcher. In a system where all the benefits are tied to your group identity, any progress made by members of that group doesn't make the category less necessary. Nope. Instead, it becomes proof that the system is working and that the category needs even more protection. So progress actually ends up strengthening the dependency on the label itself. And that brings us to the second and maybe even more profound paradox. The very thing that was the original goal, achieving upward mobility, doesn't let a person move beyond their historical label. Instead, it locks them into that identity even more tightly because their success is now seen as a product of that identity. So in a strange twist, mobility ends up freezing identity instead of setting it free. The source argues this creates a political situation it calls victimhood as capital, where historical grievance becomes a permanent political resource. And this leads to some serious distortions. For one, it completely ignores the huge differences in wealth and opportunity inside the same protected group. It also means that the most politically organized, not always the most needy, are the ones who get the benefits. The whole conversation shifts from aspiration to entitlement, and the noble search for justice starts to look more like a political negotiation. So, is this outcome just inevitable for any system like this? Well, the source suggests it doesn't have to be, and it looks at how other places around the world have tackled similar issues. If you take a look at this table, you can see a couple of different playbooks.
In the United States, for example, affirmative action policies often included the idea of sunset clauses or regular reviews. They weren't just assumed to be eternal, they had to be justified by their results. Then you look at parts of East Asia, and you see a totally different approach. Huge, universal investments in things like education and healthcare to lift everybody up, instead of focusing on preserving specific group categories. And that brings us to the final section of this analysis, the source's proposed path forward. And it's not about just tearing the system down, but about returning it to its original logic, the logic of correction, with the ultimate goal of closure.
So the source suggests a four-part recalibration. First, get the focus back on the individual's journey out of disadvantage, not the group's permanence. Second, actually measure whether the policies are working to reduce dependency over time. Third, find ways to help the neediest people within those big categories, not just the ones who are best organized. And finally, and this is a big one, it's about a psychological shift, reframing dignity as something that comes from capability, not from grievance. You know, when you boil it all down, the author's core philosophy is right here. The goal of fixing a historical injustice shouldn't be to preserve the wound as a permanent part of the social landscape. The real goal has to be to heal it, and eventually to outgrow it, so people can move beyond that history without ever having to deny it. And so we end with this question. It really challenges us to think beyond the simple ideas of compensation. It asks us what it truly takes to build a society where every single person has a real, credible path to self-respect, a path that doesn't rely on the permanent labels of the past. It's a deep question and a powerful thought to leave you with. Thanks for tuning in.